All right, 2:15 in the morning. Let's get this show on the road. All right, you've planned for that epic trip and you've prepared and made lists and notes and whatnot. But now you're in the car or on the plane and on your way. Are you truly prepared to make new images in an area that you've never seen before? I'm willing to bet that for a fair amount of you, the answer is no. And that's okay, because this is why we spend the time scouting out our locations as part of executing our plans. So there are two locations that have been very high on my list, my bucket list to check out for photography and exploration. And those areas are Death Valley and the Sierras of California. So when I had an opportunity to visit both areas in one trip, I jumped at the chance to do so. And luckily, I had plenty of time to plan for the trip since I had the first of my reservations made since June of last year. Now, if you've seen one of my early videos on this channel on planning for your photography, first I'd like to say I'm sorry. Those early videos were kind of awkward and weird, but in that video, I touched upon a lot of the apps and methods that I utilize in order to plan for my photography, whether it be locally or traveling to a remote location. Apps like Events and Maps, Photo Pills, weather apps, sunrise and sunset apps, cloud cover, etc. all play a part in planning and preparing for these trips. But once you get there, the time for a lot of that planning is over. And now it is time to execute. I think I drove too far. I'm at the beach. So as it turns out, I didn't actually end up at the beach. Quite the opposite, actually. I went to Death Valley that had elevations of thousands of feet above sea level and areas of several hundred feet below sea level, but there was no sea to be seen. There was some water, and I did see that. It didn't look that great to me because it was a bit murky, but there were some pretty cool reflections in it. The interesting side note is this is the most amount of water that had been present in the Badwater Basin of Death Valley since around 2005. One of my goals for this trip was to see sand, and not just any sand, but sand that could be found on like Tatooine, or so I thought. But the point was that for someone like me who hates the hot weather and despises humidity and is generally dehydrated, the idea of visiting a desert and climbing sand dunes was something that I've always been really interested in. But once I first got my eyes on the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, I was absolutely in awe and absolutely terrified of any of the compositions that I had planned or had in mind were actually going to work. So the only thing left to do was to start scouting out and looking at the locations I had on my map and seeing if what I had in my mind was actually going to work at all. So let's set out onto the dunes and look at what photos that I can make there. And this is how I did it. So first up, I think is the obvious one. Look for the light. You can look at the apps with the angles of the sun and the moon and all that all day long, but until you are actually there looking at the landscape, you don't know how those angles are going to really work with your subjects or the foreground or even the midground or background. The next up is going to be your composition. Without a strong composition, your photo is going to fall apart. So how are you going to tell the story of the location or still tell the story of any subjects? Are there any lines that can lead you to those certain subjects? Can you compose your image in such a way that also removes a lot of distractions from your scene? And the last is timing. Did you scope this out at lunchtime like I did? And how many people were there? As it turns out, there were actually more people at sunrise, just after sunrise at the sand dunes than there were during lunchtime when I'd originally scouted it. So this made me change some of what I was looking at and decided to try something different. So making sure you're being flexible is also crucial as well. Plus, to add a few bonus tips, these are more logistical and practical than the actual scenes you are scouting, but is there ample parking for what it is that you needed to do? Did you need to use the facilities at all? Because sometimes when nature calls, you can't exactly answer it out in nature. And lastly, do you need a permit to be there? Or are there any parking or usage fees? Make sure to have that information well before you arrive. So after all of this walking around and poking and looking and taking all of the notes, we aren't going to just walk away without some photos, right? No, of course not. There's a lot of time and money invested in our trips, and one of the measures of success that I actually use for my trips is if I can maybe get 1 or 2 photos from a particular location on a trip, I'm happy. But I'm also looking for the quality in my photos and not necessarily the quantity of photos. So after scouting out the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, I got up around sunrise one morning and gathered myself together for some photos. I didn't want to do sunrise itself on this trip for a couple of reasons. The first is sleep. I wanted to get a little bit more sleep that morning because I had actually stayed up late the night before in order to gather stars at night in Death Valley. Not for anything artistic or anything like that, but because the night sky absolutely fascinates me and I want to just play around with some night star photography. But that's a video for another day. So arriving at the dunes in the morning, I was actually met by a few photographers and tourists leaving at that moment that I was setting off. And I have to admit a little bit, I kind of enjoyed the incredulous looks of, dude, you missed it, as I set off into the sand to see if any of my scouting paid off. So I want to show you two images that came out of this scouting and this adventure. One I think that you're going to expect because of what I've covered thus far, and one that I don't think you will, or that you may not. So the first image is the result of the scouting and looking at the landscape and the absolute scale of it. This was one of those shorter dune areas that was largely untouched by anything except for the wind. The color and post-dawn light casting rippled shadows from the wind-blown sand was exactly what I had imagined in my mind when I was originally fantasizing about taking photos on this trip. So this second image is the image that I did not expect to get or set out to get. Mainly because my scouting and exploring of the area ahead of time, I was able to find this little scene amongst the giant dunes. And without pontificating too much about making sure to look down, it wasn't until I looked down and started looking around the scene and in the valleys between the dunes. Luckily, there was some hard, dried mud that was all cracked up in the one area. So I also spent some time there to capture that. When post-processing, I actually set this one to grayscale as well because I really like the contrast between the darker cracks and the lighter plates of mud that appeared to form a shield or a heart. Scouting seems to me is one of those unspoken tasks for photographers and artists at large that I think is so important for the process, especially when you're looking to shoot and make photos in an area that you haven't been before. So I want to challenge you to embrace the experience of scouting, mainly because I think that is where the adventure in photography and art happen. Taking the opportunity to slow down or change your perspective in order to find an interesting scene or something or an interesting subject to capture is more than half of the adventure. And once in a while, you may get the lucky shot in that moment as well. And sometimes the moment is to just sit there and enjoy it. So thank you very much for joining me this week, and I'll see you again next time.